The carriage door slammed shut before Evelina could say a single word. Her father stood outside in the rain, his face hard as stone, refusing to look at her. She pressed her palm against the cold glass window and called his name, but he turned away and walked back into the house without looking back. That was the moment she understood. This was not a mistake. This was not a bad dream she would wake from. She was being sent away, right now, tonight, to marry a man she had never met. The wheels of the carriage began to turn, and Evelina's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Just hours ago, she had been standing in the drawing room, laughing at a joke with her sister. Now she was alone in the dark, being taken to a manor she had only heard about in frightened whispers. Everyone in the city knew the name Alaric Thorne. They called him the ruined Duke. Some said he had caused his first wife's death. Others said his estate was cursed, that anyone who stepped inside Thornycliffe Manor never left the same person they were before. Evelina had always thought these were just stories, the kind people told to frighten children at night. She never imagined she would be sent to live inside one of those stories. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind from earlier that evening. "You have embarrassed this family for the last time," he had said, his voice low and furious. "You will marry the Duke of Thorne, and you will do it before the week is out." She had tried to argue. She had begged him to reconsider. But her father was not a man who changed his mind once it was made up, and Evelina had learned long ago that fighting him only made things worse. So she had said nothing more. She had packed a single trunk with her own hands, and now here she was, rattling down a dark road toward a man everyone feared. The carriage moved for hours. Evelina watched the countryside grow wilder and more empty as they went, the trees pressing closer to the road, the villages growing farther apart. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to remind herself that whatever waited for her at the end of this road, she would face it with her head held high. Her father wanted to break her. She refused to let him see her broken. When the carriage finally slowed, Evelina looked out the window and felt her stomach twist. Thornycliffe Manor rose out of the darkness like something built to keep people out rather than welcome them in. Its stone walls were black with age, and only a handful of windows showed any light at all. The rest of the house sat in complete darkness, as if half of it had been abandoned long ago. A servant opened the carriage door and helped her down without a word. Evelina straightened her spine and walked toward the entrance, refusing to let her legs shake even though her whole body wanted to run in the opposite direction. Inside, the hall was grand but cold. No fire burned in the great fireplace despite the chill in the air. A woman in a plain gray dress stood waiting, her expression carefully blank in the way that servants learn to master. "I am Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper," the woman said. "His Grace is expecting you, though he asked that you be shown to your room first. You must be tired from the journey." Evelina wanted to ask 100 questions. Where was the Duke? Why wasn't he here to greet his own bride? Was it true what they said about him? But something in Mrs. Whitfield's face told her that questions would not be welcome tonight, so she simply nodded and followed the housekeeper up a wide staircase. The room she was given was large and handsomely furnished, though it had the feeling of a place that had not been used in a very long time. A fire had been lit, and warm water had been prepared for her, small kindnesses that surprised her given everything she had heard about this house and its master. "Will I meet the Duke tonight?" Evelina finally asked, unable to stop herself. Mrs. Whitfield paused at the door. "His Grace does not receive guests after dark. You will meet him in the morning." She hesitated as though she wanted to say something more, then simply added, "Rest well, my lady," before closing the door behind her. Evelina sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the housekeeper left, listening to the strange silence of the house. No laughter, no distant conversation, no sound of life at all. Just the wind moving against the old windows and the occasional creak of settling wood. She thought about her sister, probably sitting safely in her own warm bed right now, completely unaware that Evelina's entire life had changed in the space of a single evening. She thought about the stories people told of Alaric Thorne, that he had locked his first wife away before she died, that he never left his estate because he could not bear to be seen in society after what he had done, that the servants who worked for him rarely stayed longer than a year before fleeing in the night. Evelina did not know which parts of these stories were true and which were exaggeration born from gossip, but she knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, she would look this man in the eye, whatever kind of man he turned out to be, and she would not let him see her fear. She barely slept that night. Every sound made her sit upright, certain that something terrible was about to happen, but nothing did. The house remained silent, and eventually exhaustion won over fear, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. She woke to gray morning light filtering through heavy curtains. A young maid entered quietly to help her dress, informing her that breakfast would be served in the small dining room, and that His Grace would be joining her. Evelina's hands trembled slightly as the maid fastened the buttons of her gown, though she forced herself to breathe slowly and steady her nerves. This was the moment. In a few minutes, she would finally see the face of the man she had been forced to marry. The small dining room was warmer than the rest of the house, a fire crackling in the hearth and sunlight breaking weakly through tall windows. A table was set for two, though only one chair was occupied when Evelina entered. The man sitting there rose to his feet the moment she stepped through the door. He was not what she expected. She had pictured someone menacing, someone whose face carried the weight of the terrible things people whispered about him. Instead, she saw a tall man with tired eyes and a guarded expression, dressed simply, with none of the arrogance she associated with noblemen of his rank. He looked at her carefully, as though trying to read something in her face, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Lady Evelina," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady, "I am sorry for the manner in which you were brought here. I imagine none of this was your choice." She had not expected an apology. She had expected coldness, cruelty, perhaps even indifference. Not this. "It was not my choice," she admitted, taking the seat he offered. "None of it. Not the engagement, not the wedding that is apparently happening within days, none of it." "Nor was it entirely mine," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Your father approached me with an arrangement I found difficult to refuse." Evelina studied his face, searching for the monster the stories described. She did not find him. What she found instead was a man who looked as though he was carrying some heavy burden, one he clearly had no intention of sharing with a stranger over breakfast. "They call you the ruined Duke," she said carefully, watching for his reaction. "I would like to know why, if you are willing to tell me." Something flickered across his face there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "In time," he said. "There will be time enough for that conversation. For now, I only ask that you give this household a chance before you judge it and before you judge me." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was not a refusal either, and something about the careful, measured way he spoke made her believe he was telling the truth, at least the part of it he was willing to share. The wedding took place 3 days later in the manor's private chapel, with only a handful of witnesses present. There was no celebration afterward, no grand feast, no dancing. Just a quiet ceremony that bound Evelina's life to a man she still barely knew, in a house full of locked doors and unanswered questions. As she stood beside him and repeated the words that would make her his wife, Evelina could not shake the feeling that she had stepped into the middle of a story that had begun long before she arrived, one with secrets buried deep enough that even the man standing beside her did not fully understand them. She did not know yet how right she was. The days after the wedding settled into a strange rhythm that Evelina had not expected. She had imagined her new husband would either ignore her completely or attempt to control every part of her life. Instead, Alaric did neither. He gave her full freedom of the house and grounds, asked nothing of her, and kept his distance in a way that felt less like coldness and more like careful avoidance. At first, she welcomed the space. It gave her time to explore the manor, to learn its long hallways and quiet rooms, to begin building some understanding of the life she now found herself living. But as the days passed, the distance began to feel less like kindness and more like a wall Alaric had built around himself, one he had no intention of letting her cross. She noticed things, small things at first, the way the servants lowered their voices whenever her husband's name came up, the way Mrs. Whitfield's expression tightened whenever Evelina asked questions about the house's history, the way an entire wing of the manor, the west wing, remained locked at all times, its heavy door bolted shut with no explanation given. One afternoon, while walking the long gallery that overlooked the gardens, Evelina paused in front of a painting she had not noticed before. It hung slightly apart from the others, in a shadowed corner where the light barely reached. The portrait showed a young woman with dark hair and striking eyes, dressed in fine clothing that suggested wealth and status. There was no name plate beneath it, nothing to identify who she was, but something about the woman's expression stayed with Evelina long after she moved on. She asked one of the younger maids about the painting later that day, a girl named Charlotte who seemed less guarded than the rest of the staff. "That would be the first Duchess, my lady," Charlotte said quietly, glancing around as though worried someone might overhear. "Lady Miranda, she passed some years back now." "What happened to her?" Evelina asked, keeping her voice gentle. Charlotte's face grew uncertain. "I could not say for certain, my lady. I was only just starting here when it happened. There was talk, of course, but talk is not always truth, is it?" "What kind of talk?" The girl hesitated, glancing toward the hallway as though checking for anyone approaching. "Some said His Grace kept her locked away in the West Wing before she died. Others said it was an illness that took her, nothing more sinister than that. I only know that His Grace has not been the same since, and that the West Wing has stayed shut ever since her passing." Evelina thanked the girl and continued walking, her mind turning over this new information. A locked wing. A dead wife whose portrait had been pushed into a shadowed corner rather than displayed with pride. A husband who flinched slightly whenever the subject of his past came up, though he never fully explained why. That evening, Evelina decided she would ask him directly. She found Alaric in the study after dinner, sitting near the fire with a book he did not appear to actually be reading. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded as always, though something in his eyes softened slightly at the sight of her. "May I ask you something?" she said, standing near the doorway rather than approaching further. He set the book aside. "Of course." "The West Wing, why is it locked?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer entirely. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed almost weary beyond his years. "There are things in that wing I am not ready to face," he said finally. "It has nothing to do with you, Evelina, I promise you that, but I ask that you leave it alone, at least for now. Is it true what they say about your first wife?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Alaric's expression shifted into something she had not seen from him before, a flash of pain so raw it startled her. "What exactly do they say?" His voice had gone quiet, careful. "That she died because of something you did, that you kept her locked away." He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for words buried somewhere in the flames. "The truth is more complicated than the stories people tell," he finally said. "I did not harm my wife, Evelina. Whatever else you have heard, I need you to know that much is not true, but I cannot yet tell you the rest of it, not because I do not trust you, but because there are pieces of this story that are not mine alone to share." It was not the full answer she wanted, but something in the way he said it, the exhaustion and old grief woven through every word, made her believe him. Whatever had happened to the first Duchess, she did not believe her husband was the villain the rumors made him out to be. "I will not push you," she said finally, "but I would like you to know that I am not afraid of the truth, whatever it turns out to be." Something like gratitude flickered across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." Over the following weeks, something between them began to shift, slowly and carefully, like two people learning to trust ground they were not certain would hold their weight. Alaric began joining her for meals more regularly. He walked with her through the garden some afternoons, pointing out plants his mother had once tended before she passed, sharing small pieces of his history that had nothing to do with the darker rumors surrounding him. Evelina found herself looking forward to these moments more than she expected to. The man she was slowly coming to know bore little resemblance to the monster London society had painted him as. He was quiet, thoughtful, and carried himself with a kind of careful restraint that suggested he was always holding something back, always protecting some wound that had never properly healed. But the mystery of the West Wing continued to gnaw at her curiosity, especially after a strange encounter with an old groundskeeper named Edmund one gray afternoon. She had gone out to walk near the stables, seeking fresh air after a morning spent indoors, when she found the old man tending to the horses. He had worked at Thornycliffe for decades, long before Alaric had even become duke, and something about his weathered, honest face made Evelina feel she could trust him. "You have been here a long time," she said, watching him work. "Longer than most," Edmund replied without looking up. "Seen a great deal happen in this house, more than most folks would believe." "Did you know the first Duchess?" The old man's hand stilled on the horse's mane. He glanced at her carefully as though weighing how much he was willing to say. "I knew her," he said finally. "Sweet lady she was. Never did understand what happened to her, not truly. One day she was laughing in the garden same as always, and not long after she was gone, and the master was never the same." "Do you believe the rumors, that the Duke was responsible?" Edmund shook his head firmly. "Not for one moment, my lady. Whatever happened to Lady Miranda, it was not the master's doing. He loved her something fierce. I have never seen a man grieve the way he grieved her passing. No, if you ask me, there is more to that story than anyone in this house has ever been told, master included." His words settled into Evelina's mind like seeds taking root. There is more to that story than anyone in this house has ever been told, master included. What could that possibly mean? If Alaric himself did not know the full truth of what happened to his first wife, then who did? That night, unable to sleep, Evelina found herself standing outside the locked door of the West Wing, her candle casting flickering shadows against the old wood. She pressed her palm flat against the door, feeling the cold seep through the wood into her skin, and wondered what secrets waited on the other side. She was so lost in thought that she did not hear footsteps approaching, until a voice spoke softly behind her. "You should not be here." She turned quickly to find Alaric standing a short distance away, dressed in a loose robe, his hair slightly disheveled as though he too had been unable to sleep. His expression was unreadable in the dim candlelight. "I could not sleep," she admitted, not bothering to pretend she had wandered here by accident. "I keep thinking about what is behind this door." He walked closer, stopping just beside her, his eyes fixed on the locked entrance as though it held some terrible weight he alone could feel. "There are things behind that door that I have not been able to face since Miranda died," he said quietly. "Letters, her belongings, things that remind me of a time I have tried very hard to leave behind." "Edmund told me something today," Evelina said carefully. "He said he did not believe the rumors about you. He said there was more to what happened to your wife than anyone here has ever fully understood, even you." Alaric's head turned sharply toward her, something unreadable flashing across his face. "What else did he say?" "Nothing more than that. But it made me wonder, Alaric, what if the truth about your wife's passing is not what you believe it to be either?" For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at the locked door as though seeing it for the first time. Then slowly, he reached into the pocket of his robe and withdrew a small brass key, one Evelina had never seen before. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "it is time I stopped running from whatever waits behind this door." He did not open it that night. Instead, he simply held the key in his palm, staring at it as though gathering the courage he had lacked for years. But something had shifted between them in that quiet hallway, some understanding that they were no longer facing this mystery alone. "Will you help me find the truth?" he asked finally, looking at her with an expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen from him. "Yes," Evelina said without hesitation. "Whatever we find, we will find it together." Neither of them could have known, standing together in that dim hallway, just how far that truth would reach, or how deeply it would connect back to Evelina's own family and the father who had sent her here in the first place. 3 days passed before Alaric finally unlocked the door to the West Wing, and when he did, he asked Evelina to be at his side. The room they entered first had clearly not been touched in years. Dust covered every surface, and the air carried the stale, heavy scent of a space long sealed away from light and life. Furniture sat draped in white cloth, ghostly shapes in the dim afternoon light that filtered through curtains someone had once drawn shut and never opened again. Evelina watched her husband move through the room slowly, his hand trailing over covered furniture as though touching memories he had tried for years to forget. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight with a tension that spoke of old pain rising back to the surface. "This was her sitting room," he said quietly. "She used to read here every morning by that window. I have not been inside this room since the day she died." Evelina said nothing, simply staying close, letting him move through the space at his own pace. She understood, without needing to be told, that this was not just a search for answers. This was Alaric finally confronting a grief he had locked away for years, in the same way he had locked away this entire wing of his home. They found the letters in a writing desk near the window, tucked beneath a false bottom in one of the drawers, hidden so carefully that Evelina almost missed them entirely. There were dozens of pages, written in a careful, elegant hand that Alaric identified immediately as belonging to Miranda. "She kept a journal," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted the pages carefully. "I never knew." They carried the letters to the study, where better light allowed them to read more carefully. What they found inside those pages painted a picture entirely different from the story London society had told for years. Miranda's early entries spoke of happiness, of a marriage she treasured, of a husband she described with clear affection and warmth. But as the pages progressed, her tone began to shift. She wrote of feeling watched, of strange visitors arriving when Alaric was away from the estate, of conversations she overheard between servants that troubled her deeply. One entry, dated only weeks before her death, caught Evelina's attention immediately. "I do not know who to trust anymore," Miranda had written. "Lord Ashworth visited again today while Alaric was traveling. He speaks kindly enough, but there is something in his eyes I do not like. He asks strange questions about the estate, about Alaric's finances, about matters that are not his concern. I fear he means us harm, though I cannot say why I believe this so strongly." Evelina's breath caught in her throat. Lord Ashworth, her own father. "What does this mean?" she asked, looking up at Alaric, whose face had gone rigid with shock and something darker, something closer to anger. "I do not know," he admitted. "I did not know your father visited Miranda during that time. I was traveling often that year, dealing with matters in the north. I trusted the household to manage in my absence." They continued reading, finding entry after entry that mentioned strange visits, whispered conversations, and a growing sense of unease that Miranda had clearly felt but never fully understood. The final entries, written just days before her death, spoke of a meeting she had planned to have, one she believed would finally explain the strange happenings around the estate. "I intend to speak with him directly," she had written. "If Lord Ashworth means to harm this family, I will not sit quietly and allow it. Alaric returns in 3 days. I will tell him everything the moment he arrives." But Alaric had returned to find his wife already gone, her death explained away as a sudden illness that no physician could properly diagnose. The scandal that followed painted him as the villain, whispered accusations spreading through society faster than any truth could catch up. "Someone silenced her," Evelina said slowly, the realization settling over her like ice water, before she could tell you what she discovered. Alaric's hands had begun to shake as he set the letters down carefully on the desk. "If your father was involved in whatever happened to Miranda, then the arrangement that brought you here, the marriage your father forced upon both of us, it was never a punishment for you alone. It was something else entirely." Evelina felt sick as pieces began falling into place in her mind, forming a picture far darker than anything she had imagined when she first arrived at Thornycliffe Manor. She thought back to the night her father had announced her punishment, the strange urgency in his voice, the way he had refused to look at her as the carriage pulled away. She had believed it was simply anger over her behavior. Now she wondered if there had been something else driving his decision entirely. "I need to understand what my father wanted from your family," she said. "There has to be more to this than what we have found so far." Over the following days, Evelina began writing to contacts back home, carefully worded letters that asked questions without revealing too much of what she and Alaric had discovered. She wrote to her old governess, a woman named Margaret who had remained close to the family for years and who might know something of her father's business dealings. She wrote to her sister, gently probing for any information about strange visitors or hushed conversations she might remember from years past. While waiting for responses, she and Alaric continued searching through the West Wing, uncovering more pieces of the puzzle with each passing day. In a locked chest beneath Miranda's bed, they found financial documents that seemed entirely out of place among a young duchess's personal belongings, records of transactions between the Ashworth and Thorne estates that neither Evelina nor Alaric had ever known existed. "These predate our marriage by years," Alaric said, studying the documents with a furrowed brow. "Your father was involved with my family's finances long before either of us were born, it seems." The documents revealed a complicated web of loans and investments, agreements that appeared to have benefited the Earl of Ashworth significantly while placing the Thorne estate in increasingly precarious financial positions. Evelina began to understand that her father's interest in the Thorne family had never been personal. It had been strategic, calculated, and pursued over the course of many years. "He needed something from your family," she said slowly, piecing the puzzle together aloud. "Something valuable enough that he was willing to manipulate both estates to get it." They found the answer several days later, hidden among Miranda's personal correspondence in a letter that had never been sent, addressed to a solicitor whose name meant nothing to either of them at first. But a quick search through the estate's own records revealed the connection they had been missing. The solicitor had once represented both the Ashworth and Thorne families, before a falling out that had never been fully explained in any records either family kept. Evelina wrote to this solicitor directly, using a false name to protect her identity while she gathered information. The reply that came back several weeks later confirmed everything they had begun to suspect. Her father had orchestrated a series of financial arrangements designed to slowly drain the Thorne estate of its resources. Believing that a weakened, scandal-ridden duke would be easier to control and manipulate for his own political ambitions. Miranda had discovered this scheme before her death. She had planned to expose it, to protect her husband's family from further harm. And somehow, before she could act on that plan, she had died under circumstances that no one had ever properly investigated. "Your father needed the scandal," Alaric said quietly one evening, staring into the fire with an expression of quiet, controlled fury. "A dead duchess and a husband painted as her murderer served his purposes far better than a living, watchful wife who had already begun to see through his schemes." "And when the scandal did not destroy your family entirely," Evelina added, the pieces finally clicking together in her mind, He needed another way to maintain control. Marrying me to you accomplished exactly that. He could keep watch over your family through me, ensure you remained weakened and dependent, all while appearing to simply be punishing his difficult daughter. The realization sat heavy between them. Evelina had spent weeks believing her marriage was punishment for her own behavior, a consequence of her father's anger over a minor social embarrassment. Now she understood the truth was far more calculated and far more disturbing. She had been a tool in her father's scheme from the very beginning, a piece moved into place without her knowledge or consent. "I am sorry," she said quietly, unable to look at Alaric directly. "I did not know. I would never have agreed to any part of this if I had understood what my father intended." "I know that," he said, his voice gentler than she expected. "None of this is your fault, Evelina. We are both victims of the same scheme, caught in a web your father spun long before either of us had any say in the matter." But knowing the truth was not the same as knowing what to do with it. Evelina's father remained a powerful man in London society, with connections and influence that could easily crush any accusation she and Alaric might bring against him. Without solid proof, without something undeniable that could not be dismissed as bitter gossip or wild imagination, exposing him would accomplish nothing except placing both of their reputations at further risk. "We need proof," Evelina said finally, straightening her shoulders with new determination. "Something undeniable, something he cannot explain away or bury beneath his own influence." Alaric nodded slowly, a spark of something resolute finally breaking through the grief and shock that had clouded his expression for days. "Then we will find it. Whatever it takes, we will find the truth, and we will make certain your father answers for what he has done, both to Miranda and to this family." For the first time since her arrival at Thornycliffe Manor, Evelina felt something other than fear or confusion driving her forward. She felt purpose. Whatever punishment her father had intended for her, whatever scheme he had woven around her marriage, she refused to remain simply a pawn in his design any longer. Together, she and Alaric began planning their next steps carefully, knowing that whatever they uncovered next would need to be strong enough to withstand the full weight of her father's influence and reputation. They had no idea yet just how deep the deception ran, or how close to home the final piece of evidence would ultimately be found. The letter from Margaret arrived on a cold morning nearly 2 weeks after Evelina had first written to her, and the moment she broke the seal and began reading, she knew this was the piece of evidence they had been searching for. Margaret had served the Ashworth household for over 20 years, first as Evelina's governess and later as a trusted friend to the family. In her careful, looping handwriting, she described something she had witnessed years earlier but had never fully understood until Evelina's questions prompted her to think back more carefully on what she had seen. She wrote of a night, many years before, when Lord Ashworth had returned home late, his clothes disheveled and his manner unusually agitated. She had overheard him speaking with his solicitor in hushed, urgent tones, discussing something that needed to be handled quietly and quickly before it could cause complications. At the time, Margaret had assumed it was simply business matters, the kind of financial concerns that wealthy men often discussed behind closed doors. But one phrase had stayed lodged in her memory all these years, a phrase she had never understood until now. Her father had said, according to Margaret's careful recollection, that the Duchess's illness needed to progress naturally, without any suspicion falling on the household, and that certain arrangements needed to be finalized before word of her condition spread any further. Evelina read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of its implications settled over her. This was not simply financial manipulation or political scheming. This suggested something far more sinister, something that pointed directly toward her father's involvement in Miranda's actual death, not merely the scandal that followed it. She brought the letter immediately to Alaric, who read it in silence, his face growing paler with each line. When he finished, he set the paper down carefully, as though handling something fragile enough to shatter at the slightest pressure. "This confirms what Miranda feared," he said quietly. "Your father did not simply want to control this family through financial pressure. He wanted her gone entirely, and he made certain her death would look natural enough that no one would think to question it." Evelina felt sick with a combination of grief and fury that she had never experienced before. This was her own father they were speaking of, the man who had raised her, who had sat across the dinner table from her every evening of her childhood. And now she was forced to confront the possibility that he had orchestrated the death of an innocent woman simply to further his own ambitions. "We need more than Margaret's memory of a conversation from years ago," Alaric said finally, though his voice carried none of the doubt his words suggested. He believed the account completely. He simply understood, as Evelina did, that memory alone would never be enough to bring down a man as powerful as the Earl of Ashworth. "We need something concrete, documents, records, something that cannot be dismissed as an old woman's faulty recollection." They spent the following days combing through every remaining document in the West Wing, searching for anything that might corroborate what Margaret had witnessed all those years ago. It was Evelina, working late one evening in Miranda's old writing desk, who finally found the piece they needed. Tucked into the lining of an old traveling case, clearly hidden with great care, was a small collection of letters written between her father and a physician whose name neither of them recognized at first. The letters were carefully coded, using vague language that avoided any direct admission of wrongdoing, but the pattern they revealed was unmistakable once properly examined. The physician had been paid substantial sums over a period of several months before Miranda's death, described in the letters only as compensation for discretion regarding a delicate family matter. The final letter, dated just days before Miranda passed, contained a chilling line that left no room for interpretation once Evelina understood the full context surrounding it. "The matter will be resolved by the week's end," the physician had written. "The Duchess's condition will proceed as we discussed, and there will be no cause for further concern once this is finished." "This is it," Evelina said, her voice barely above a whisper as she handed the letters to Alaric. "This is the proof we need." But even with this evidence in hand, Evelina understood that confronting her father directly carried enormous risk. He remained connected to powerful figures throughout London society, men who owed him favors, or feared his influence enough to look the other way regardless of what evidence might be presented against him. A private accusation, made quietly, could easily be buried, dismissed, or worse, could result in retaliation against both Evelina and Alaric before any justice could be served. "If we approach this quietly, he will find a way to bury it," Alaric said, packing slowly across the study as he considered their options. "We need to expose this publicly, in a manner he cannot control or explain away." Evelina thought carefully, her mind working through the possibilities. Her father was scheduled to attend a significant gathering in just 2 weeks' time, a grand event hosted by one of the most influential families in London, attended by nearly everyone of importance in society. If the truth came out there, in front of witnesses who could not simply be silenced or bought, her father would have no way to hide from the consequences of what he had done. "The Pemberton gathering," she said slowly. "Everyone who matters will be there. If we present this evidence publicly in front of enough witnesses, he cannot simply make it disappear." Alaric considered this carefully, weighing the risks against the potential outcome. "It is a significant gamble," he said finally. "If we fail to convince the gathering of the truth, if your father manages to twist the narrative even with evidence in hand, the consequences for both of us could be severe." "I understand the risk," Evelina said, meeting his eyes steadily. "But I cannot continue living quietly while my father walks free, knowing what he has done. Miranda deserves justice. This family deserves the truth, after everything my father has taken from you." Something shifted in Alaric's expression as he studied her, a mixture of respect and something warmer that had been slowly growing between them over the past weeks. "You have changed since you first arrived here," he said quietly. "The woman who stepped out of that carriage weeks ago was frightened and uncertain. The woman standing before me now is prepared to face down one of the most powerful men in London to see justice done." "I have had good reason to change," Evelina replied, a small, tired smile crossing her face despite the gravity of their situation. "This house, this family, this truth we have uncovered together, it has shown me what I am truly capable of, when given the chance to fight for something that matters." They spent the following 2 weeks preparing carefully for the confrontation ahead, gathering additional evidence where they could, consulting quietly with a solicitor Alaric trusted implicitly, a man with no connection whatsoever to Evelina's father, who could advise them on the best way to present their findings without leaving room for dismissal or doubt. Evelina also wrote once more to her sister, this time being far more direct about what she had discovered, though she was careful to protect her sister from any danger that might come from being too closely associated with the coming confrontation. Her sister's reply came back swiftly, filled with shock and disbelief at first, but ultimately expressing full support for whatever path Evelina chose to take. "Our father has always been a difficult man," her sister had written, "but I never imagined him capable of something so terrible. Whatever you decide to do, know that I stand with you completely, regardless of what it might cost either of us within society." As the night of the Pemberton gathering approached, Evelina found herself standing once more in front of Miranda's portrait in the long gallery, studying the face of a woman she had never met but whose fate had become so deeply intertwined with her own. She thought about the courage it must have taken for Miranda to plan her confrontation with whoever had been threatening her family, courage that had ultimately cost her life before she could see it through. "I will finish what you started," Evelina said quietly to the painted image, feeling somehow that Miranda deserved this promise, deserved to know that her death would not remain buried in silence and false rumor forever. "Whatever it costs me, the truth will be known." Behind her, she heard soft footsteps approaching, and turned to find Alaric standing nearby, watching her with an expression of quiet warmth that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks. "Are you ready for tomorrow night?" he asked gently. Evelina turned back to face the portrait one final time before answering. "I am ready to make certain that neither of us has to live in the shadow of my father's lies for a single day longer." Tomorrow night, everything would change. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk to her own reputation and standing within the very society that had once mocked her husband so mercilessly, Evelina understood that she could no longer remain silent while the truth sat buried beneath years of carefully constructed deception. The time had finally come to bring it into the light, no matter who it destroyed in the process. The Pemberton ballroom glittered with candlelight, and the sound of 100 conversations weaving together into a low, constant hum. Evelina stood near the edge of the great room, dressed in deep blue silk, her hand resting lightly on Alaric's arm as they made their way through the crowd. She could feel eyes turning toward them as they walked, the familiar weight of whispers and stares that had followed her husband for years now settling briefly onto her as well. She spotted her father across the room within moments of their arrival. He stood near the far windows, deep in conversation with several other gentlemen of considerable influence, laughing at something one of them had said, entirely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. "Are you certain about this?" Alaric asked quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him. "There is still time to reconsider, to find another way forward." "There is no other way," Evelina replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "Not one that ends with the truth properly told." They moved through the crowd slowly, exchanging polite greetings and forced pleasantries with acquaintances who had no idea what was about to unfold. Evelina caught sight of Lord Pemberton himself, a man known throughout London for his fairness and his genuine influence over matters of society, and made her way carefully toward him, Alaric close behind her. "Lord Pemberton," she said, offering a graceful curtsy, "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time this evening, along with a request that may seem unusual." The older man regarded her with curious interest. "Of course, Lady Thorne. What can I do for you?" Evelina glanced briefly at Alaric, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her, before turning back to Lord Pemberton with a calm she did not entirely feel inside. "I have information concerning a matter of great importance, evidence of wrongdoing that touches both my own family and that of my husband. I would ask that you allow me a brief moment before your guests tonight to bring this matter into the open, in front of witnesses who can attest to what is revealed." Lord Pemberton's expression grew serious, his curiosity sharpening into something more focused. He had known both families for decades and had heard the old rumors surrounding Alaric's first marriage many times over the years, though he had always maintained a careful neutrality on the matter. "This is a significant request," he said slowly. "Are you certain of what you intend to reveal?" "Completely certain," Evelina replied without hesitation. "And I believe, once you understand what I have discovered, you will agree this cannot remain buried any longer." After a long moment of consideration, Lord Pemberton nodded slowly. "Very well. I will call for quiet shortly. But I warn you, Lady Thorne, whatever you intend to say tonight will not be easily forgotten by anyone in this room, regardless of how the truth eventually settles." "I am counting on that," Evelina said quietly. 15 minutes later, the orchestra fell silent, and Lord Pemberton's voice rose above the crowd, calling for attention in a tone that immediately hushed the room. Evelina felt Alaric's hand find hers, his fingers lacing through her own in a gesture of quiet support as every eye in the ballroom turned toward them. Her father's face, visible across the crowded room, shifted from confusion to alarm as he realized his daughter was the reason for this sudden interruption. Evelina stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she began to speak. "Many of you know the rumors surrounding my husband, the Duke of Thorne," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "You have heard him called ruined, blamed for tragedy, whispered about for years without ever knowing the true circumstances surrounding his first wife's death. Tonight, I intend to correct that record, with evidence that I believe speaks for itself." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and she could see her father beginning to push forward through the guests, his face pale with something between fury and fear. "Evelina, stop this immediately," he called out, though his voice lacked its usual commanding authority, cracking slightly with barely controlled panic. She ignored him, continuing steadily, describing the letters found within the West Wing, the correspondence between her father and a physician who had been paid to ensure Miranda's death appeared entirely natural. She described the financial documents revealing years of calculated manipulation, designed to weaken the Thorne estate for her father's own political benefit. She described Margaret's testimony, the overheard conversation from years ago that had never made sense until now. As she spoke, Alaric produced the actual documents, handing them to Lord Pemberton for inspection, allowing several other prominent guests to examine the evidence directly rather than simply take Evelina's word alone. The physician's letters, written in his own unmistakable hand, left little room for doubt once properly read and understood in context. The room had gone utterly silent, every guest watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and fascination. Her father stood frozen near the center of the crowd, surrounded by faces that had once respected and feared him, now looking at him with dawning horror as the truth settled over the gathering. "These are fabrications," he finally managed, his voice strained. "Lies constructed to destroy my reputation, nothing more." "Then perhaps you can explain the physician's own handwriting," Alaric said calmly, stepping forward beside Evelina. "Or the financial records bearing your own seal, detailing transactions with my estate that predate my marriage to your daughter by many years. records that show a clear and deliberate effort to weaken my family's standing long before any scandal touched my name. The Earl of Ashworth had no answer that satisfied the crowd surrounding him. Whispers turned to open discussion, faces that had once smiled warmly at him now regarding him with cold suspicion. Lord Pemberton, after carefully examining the documents himself, addressed the room with grave authority. "This evidence appears substantial," he announced. "I believe it warrants formal investigation, and I will personally see that the appropriate authorities are informed before this night is finished." Her father's world collapsed in the span of a single evening. Within days, formal investigations were launched into his financial dealings and the circumstances surrounding Miranda's death. The physician, faced with mounting evidence and the threat of severe consequences, ultimately confirmed the truth of what had happened, providing testimony that sealed the case against the man who had once controlled so much of London society through fear and manipulation. The scandal that followed dwarfed anything that had ever touched Alaric's name. Where once he had been whispered about as the ruined Duke, society now spoke of him with quiet sympathy, understanding at last the terrible injustice he had endured for years without ever knowing the true source of his suffering. In the weeks that followed, as the formal proceedings against her father continued, Evelina and Alaric returned to Thornycliffe Manor, finally able to breathe freely for the first time since her arrival there months earlier. Together, they opened the West Wing fully, airing out rooms that had been sealed away for years, restoring Miranda's portrait to its rightful place among the family gallery rather than hidden in a shadowed corner. "She deserves to be remembered properly," Alaric said, standing beside Evelina as workers carefully rehung the painting in a place of honor. "Not as a tragedy or a scandal, but as the woman she truly was, brave enough to try to protect this family even at the cost of her own life." Evelina found herself thinking often of Miranda in the months that followed, grateful in some strange way that her own path had led to finally uncovering the truth that had eluded justice for so many years. What had begun as a punishment, a forced marriage designed to control and manipulate two unwilling people, had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted when Evelina first stepped out of that carriage into the darkness of Thornycliffe Manor. The house itself seemed to change in the months that followed, as though shedding years of accumulated grief and secrecy. Windows that had remained shuttered for years were opened to let in fresh light. Servants who had once whispered nervously in dark corners now laughed openly in the halls. The manor that had once felt like a prison built of stone and silence slowly transformed into something Evelina had never expected to find there. A home. One evening, many months after the truth had finally come to light, Evelina found Alaric in the garden, tending carefully to the flowers his mother had once planted, flowers that had been neglected for years, but were now beginning to flourish again under careful attention. "I never thanked you properly," he said, looking up as she approached, "for refusing to accept the easy path when you discovered the truth about your father. You could have remained silent, protected your own reputation, avoided the scandal that followed. Instead, you chose justice, even knowing what it would cost you personally." "I could not have lived with myself otherwise," Evelina replied, kneeling beside him among the flowers. "And besides, I did not do it alone. We found the truth together, and I do not believe either of us could have carried that burden without the other beside us." Alaric reached over, taking her hand gently in his own, an easy warmth passing between them that had grown steadily over the months they had spent together, built not on the forced circumstances that had first brought them together, but on genuine trust and understanding earned through shared struggle. "What began as a punishment," he said quietly, "has become the greatest gift I have ever received." Evelina smiled, looking around at the garden slowly returning to life around them, at the manor standing tall and bright behind them, finally free of the shadows that had haunted it for so many years. "For both of us," she agreed softly. The Earl of Ashworth's trial concluded several months later, his reputation and influence utterly destroyed by evidence too substantial to deny or explain away. Justice, delayed for years by wealth and power, had finally caught up with him, brought about not by grand authorities or powerful institutions, but by his own daughter, a woman he had once believed too difficult and troublesome to control. At Thornycliffe Manor, life continued forward, built now on honesty rather than secrets, on partnership rather than punishment. What had started as a forced marriage, meant to break Evelina's spirit and control both families through fear and manipulation, had instead created something her father never could have anticipated or understood. A true and lasting bond, forged through shared hardship and built to last far longer than any scheme he had ever devised. And in the long gallery of Thornycliffe Manor, Miranda's portrait hung proudly once more, no longer a hidden secret shrouded in shadow, but a reminder of courage, truth, and the price sometimes paid to bring justice into the light, however long it might take to arrive.